Welcome to the Jonathan Club, home of the Jonathan Art Foundation. These walls hold one of the premier collections of early California plein air art of any private club.
Welcome to the beautiful lobby of the Jonathan's downtown location. I am Dale Harbor Day, a former president of the Art Foundation and also a current club board member. We are standing in the lobby where members meet their friends and guests, and they can enjoy the California Impressionism, also called California plein air art, that we all enjoy and that the club has been collecting for many years. In 1895, Los Angeles was a small town of 70,000 people. In that year, a group of enterprising young businessmen decided to gather to support the then Republican candidates running for elected office. The gentlemen had great success, and after that election in 1896, they decided they had too much alcohol left to drink, that they would become a social club and would no longer have a political affiliation. They also chose the name Brother Jonathan as a symbol and a name for their club because in pre-Civil War times, leading into the late 1800s, Brother Jonathan was an American character of wit and charm that these young men thought exemplified the character and the face that they wanted to project to the greater LA community. Railroad magnate Henry Edwards Huntington was an early member. He, in 1905, had just completed his spectacular new Pacific Electric building. He offered the top 2 floors of that club for the club to have their offices and gathering and watering hole. However, in the early 1920s, the club members thought, we've outgrown this space and we need our own clubhouse here in Los Angeles. A site was found on Figueroa at 6th Street. Renowned hotel architects, and these were nationally renowned architects, Leonard Schultz and S. Fullerton Weaver, who had designed the Waldorf Astoria in New York, both the Hotel Pierre and Hotel Sherry Netherland, also in New York, the Breakers in Palm Beach, the Clift Hotel in San Francisco, and the Biltmores in Atlanta, Coral Gables, and Los Angeles. The gentlemen came in with a $3 million budget and developed this 12-story Italian Renaissance flagship here on the West Coast for the club. They also brought in a recent Italian immigrant, Giovanni Battista Smeraldi, who painted the ceilings on all 3 of the first floor that are public rooms here, and we still enjoy these ceilings today because they have been restored and are a visual sight to behold. The club opened to its membership on December the 14th in 1925. There were 600 members in attendance, seated in the main dining room up on the 3rd floor, and also in the grill room, which is on the 2nd floor. Shortly thereafter, the English Automobile Club, who was building a new clubhouse in London, decided to examine clubs all over the world to determine best features for their new clubhouse to be built in the late 20s. They rated our new Jonathan Club as the finest that they had reviewed. Only 3 pieces of art, 1 painting by Granville Redmond that Henry Huntington purchased directly from the artist, and 2 pieces of sculpture moved from the Pacific Electric building into this great big clubhouse back in 1925. However, club members to this day still believe that great clubs have great art collections. That has been the premise of the continued collecting that members do here. The 12-story headquarters plus a solarium on the top, which makes it 13 floors, were built to a 150-foot height limit. And until 1957, only the LA City Hall had a taller building here in the Los Angeles area. In 1935, the Jonathan Club bought an additional clubhouse on the Santa Monica Beach, and it is still enjoyed today by over 3,800 current members.
We are here in our beautiful Florentine lounge. The Jonathan Art Foundation was established in 1986. We are a 501c3 organization responsible for the preservation, display, education, acquisition, and lending of both the club and foundation's artwork. The Jonathan Club had several locations prior to 1925, the most notable being the Pacific Electric building owned by Henry Huntington, a president of the club. Previous locations displayed what we fondly call 3D art: vases, statues, sconces, and chandeliers. Moving to the Figueroa location, it was realized that we needed to switch to vertical paintings to cover our 13 floors of wall space. The Live Artist Membership Program, probably started by Henry Huntington, was a huge success. Trading works of art for membership helped fill our walls with early California plein air art. Artists included Jack Wilkinson Smith, George Brandreth, Theodore Lukatz, and Arthur Beaumont. Theodore Lukatz left over 300 of his paintings to the Jonathan Art Foundation when he passed away. They are located throughout the club. On the 8th and 9th floor is dedicated to his artwork. His vast work is not included in our tour today. The Art Foundation established the Resident Artist Program in 1991, which includes Robert Glenn Ketchum, the famous photographer, George Bromer, and Peter Alexander. A longtime employee, Jane Lauman, worked for the club over 60 years. Never married and with no children, Jane set up a trust and left her entire estate to the Jonathan Art Foundation. As you view our premier collection of early California plein air art, the finest of any private club, we thank Jane for her generous contribution. Our docent tours and programs are available by appointment and can be tailored to your needs. Rich Reitzel, the author of The Art at the Jonathan Club, will take you on a virtual tour of our collection.
Thank you, Judy. It's a great pleasure to be here today in the lobby of the Jonathan Club, surrounded by some of the most wonderful paintings done by the early California Impressionists. This room in the Jonathan Club has a virtual who's who of the early California artists. And we're going to go on a tour and take a closer look at some of those paintings on this video. But before we do that, I'd like to go back about 150 years to the beginning of the Impressionist movement. We're back in Paris in the mid-19th century, at a time when the French Academy of Fine Arts really dominated the art scene for the Western world. Paris was the center of art, and the Salon exhibitions that were executed every year was the seminal event that people aspired to. In the late 1860s, there was a group of artists whose names would become very familiar in the future. Names like Renoir, Monet, Degas, Pissarro, who had just started a new style of art. They were learning from each other, and they were creating art that was very different from what had been the widely taught academic style of art. This new art was done quickly, often out in the open, in plein air, in the open air. It had fast strokes, lots of brush strokes, thick, heavy paint, unmixed colors, and was created to basically capture the effect of light on the canvas. The other thing that had changed is that the subjects of these artists tended to be subjects of everyday events, life in the city, a gathering in the park, a quiet moment on the banks of the Seine. Previously, most art, particularly art that was in the Salon exhibitions, tended to tell biblical stories, allegorical tales, mythology, contemplative landscapes of the French countryside. So it was a very different style of art. The artists were frustrated that their entries to the Salon continually got rejected. So in the early 1870s, they created their own independent exhibition and started to show their style of art in their own show. It wasn't very well accepted at first, and in fact, it was derisively termed Impressionism by the critics. The idea that the art wasn't finished, it was just an impression of art. Over the next 10 years, however, Impressionism slowly caught on and ultimately would become one of the most popular styles of art in the world. It also was incredibly important for those of you interested in art history in that by breaking from the conventions of the Salon exhibition and the academic teachings of the French Academy of Fine Arts, it set the stage for future changes in how color and form and line and space would be represented on canvas. So it very much set the stage for future movements such as Cubism, Modernism, Fauvism, and even later Abstract Expressionism. As Impressionism caught on, it traveled to the United States. Exhibitions came to New York City, came to Boston, and the American artists got exposed to this new style of art. And many of them, including artists like John Singer Sargent, William Merritt Chase, Childe Hassam, and others, adopted the style and became very successful. The artists that would migrate to Southern California trained under those people and trained in the cities of Europe where Impressionism was being taught. So it was only natural that in the early 1900s, the early 20th century, when the artists moved to Southern California for the same reason that everybody else did, the climate, the opportunity, the chance to make an economic living, and a new start, and chasing some scenery that was unavailable elsewhere, particularly on the East Coast and in the Midwest. These artists had been trained in Impressionism, and it was that style that came with the artists as they took up shop here. Interesting enough, the form of Impressionism that came out from the California artists of the day was very different from that on the Parisian streets. It wasn't the cafes, it wasn't the quiet city life. It was almost without exception a reverential view of the scenery around Southern California. The seascapes, the valleys, the mountains, almost always portrayed without the footprint of man, but a reverential capturing representation of the beautiful scenery around them. Earlier, Dale referred to the move in the 1920s of the Jonathan Club to the new building here at 545 Figueroa. As part of that effort, the club initiated a resident program. And the very first artist that was brought into that artist in residence program was Jack Wilkinson Smith. At the time, he was a very noted LA painter. He'd been born in 1873 in Paterson, New Jersey. He spent most of his training and younger career in Cincinnati, trained at the Art Institute of Chicago, and in 1908 came out to Los Angeles to better his fortunes. On arrival in Los Angeles, he was one of the first major players to get involved with the Biltmore Salon, which would become a noted gallery. He became noted for his Sierra scenes and his seascapes, and was a prolific painter, and the club is the beneficiary of that. Currently, 4 major and some of the finest works he created are hanging at the Jonathan Club. 2 of them are seascapes. One, a large canvas with a close-up shot of waves crashing on the rocks. The second one, a little bit different painting of the Oregon coast, one of the few early California Impressionist paintings in the club that is not a California scene. But that particular painting is a fine example of his work. The foreground with the rocks and tide pools, the background with kind of the misty fog hanging over the rocks of the Oregon coastline. There's also a major painting that hangs over the fireplace at the club that is of the area around Crystal Cove in Orange County. A large canvas with kind of a quiescent scene of the Pacific Ocean and rocks in the background. Another very different painting that hangs at the club is Mountain Glacier, Up on the third floor, it's one of the few nocturnes that I've ever seen executed by Jack Wilkinson Smith. A beautiful scene of a close-up of a craggy, rocky precipice of the Sierras and kind of a snowfield in the foreground, which creates a completely different feeling. This wonderful painting is by Guy Rose. Laguna Rocks Low Tide is a great example of his style. Guy Rose led a very interesting life. He was born in San Gabriel, California, and he was a young son of a ranching family that owned a great deal of land in the San Gabriel Valley. In fact, the community Rosemead is now named after them. His father was a former senator, and he obviously grew up with affluence. He was a very slight child with a number of brothers that were big, brawny ranch hands, but he found an early love for art, and his family definitely supported that love. He followed the art career, and he actually spent over 20 years in Paris and in France in 2 different stays. He had a chance to spend 11 years in Giverny, and actually was one of the few American artists over there who did have a contact with Claude Monet when he was there. This painting is a wonderful example of his style. You have a very feathery touch, light dabs of paint, in a typical style where you see this aerial perspective. If you look at the back of the painting, you have smooth textures in the sky and the sea, and a little bit of a vague kind of foggy effect. If you look in the foreground of the picture, you see much more color, much more texture with the brush strokes. In the rocks, you see these purples, these mauves, all these colors, little mustard yellows that all work together to create this effect of very strong foreground. This particular painting appeared in Laguna Art Museum's seminal 1985 show about California Impressionism, which was one of the shows that really led to a resurgence in interest in this particular genre. Guy Rose is one of the more collectible artists, and also one of the more expensive artists, if you will. And part of it is he only painted in Southern California for about 7 or 8 years. And he was one of the few artists that are in the collection that didn't have to sell paintings to make a living. So if he didn't like a painting, he would paint over it or destroy it. So there's really very few Guy Roses that are out in the collection. This is probably one of the crown jewels of the collection. When we acquired it, we thought a Guy Rose painting would be out of our means. We were very fortunate that the Jane Lauman Trust was able to afford us to allow us to get this particular painting. The collectors will sometimes say there's 2 types of collections. There's those that have a Guy Rose, and there's those that don't. We are thrilled that we have a Guy Rose. Let's move on. This painting, Winter in Topanga by Elmer Wachtel, is a great example of his style of art. It's also a great example of what is said about the early California Impressionists and their art as a boon to tourism. Think about the wealthy Midwesterners who came out during the winter months and had this as their representation of wintertime in California. And of course, that was a major part of the allure of California at the time. Elmer Wachtel, born in 1864 in Baltimore, grew up in Illinois and moved out at the age of 20 to Southern California. He actually had a brother who had married one of the sisters of Guy Rose. So when he came out, he worked on the Rose Ranch, had taken art lessons, and continued to pursue art when he got out here. This painting is a good example of Elmer Wachtel's style. Very frequently, he had the shaded foregrounds and kind of the sunlit backgrounds, which again is an artist's device to kind of draw you into the painting. Here you have the blotches of sun breaking through the clouds after a rain. You've got the kind of faded, vague, misty background that creates a sense of depth. But clearly you have this sense of the California landscape, which was the central focus of his particular paintings. Wachtel was also an interesting character. He was very prolific and very good at the violin, and actually sat for a period of time as first violin at the LA Philharmonic. He would go on to marry one of his students, Marianne Cavanaugh, became Marianne Cavanaugh Wachtel, and we're actually going to look at one of her watercolors in just a few minutes. This painting, April Morning, Santa Monica Canyon, is a wonderful watercolor by Marion Wachtel. We mentioned Marion a few moments ago when we looked at the painting by her husband Elmer. Marion was born in Milwaukee in 1876. Both her mom and her grandparents were artists, so she really was born with an artistic bent, and it was in her blood. She trained at the Art Institute of Chicago and actually would go on to teach there for several years. In 1903, she received a commission from the Santa Fe Railroad to go out to Southern California to paint, if you will, tourism posters and paintings for their promotional campaigns opening up the West. When she arrived, she met William Keith and actually was a protege of his, and he was her teacher in mostly Northern California. William ultimately introduced her to Elmer, and it wasn't long after that they were married and became a husband and wife duo. Interesting enough, she kept her maiden name as a middle name when she signed her paintings, so it was Marion Cavanaugh Wachtel. She painted in watercolor, which I'm always amazed by, because with oil painting, if you make a mistake, you let it dry, you paint over it. If you make a mistake doing watercolor, that's it. You start over on paper. But she was a very talented watercolorist, perhaps the best of the Southern California scene. After Elmer died in 1929, she actually went on to paint in oils for the rest of her career and was as equally talented in that medium. This painting by Jean Mannheim, Arch Beach Laguna, is a classic example of his style. Painted in the early 1920s, it's the highlands above Arch Beach, and is one of the few paintings you'll see of the Impressionists that actually has some sign of man in it, meaning the houses. It's interesting because his studio, his summer studio, was just to the right of this picture. I have to tell you, Mannheim is a particular favorite of mine. He's actually my great-grandfather, and I've been fortunate enough to see a lot of his paintings and hear a lot of stories about him. But he was one of the major players in the Southern California scene. He was part of the Arroyo Seco colony, and then, as I mentioned, had a summer studio down in Laguna Beach. He was a founding member of both the Laguna Beach Art Association and also the California Art Club. This particular painting, probably painted in June when he escaped the heat of Pasadena, is a classic June gloom type painting, which was one of his favorite styles. You have the kind of gray clouds, the morning. You have, even though it's springtime and we're starting to see the colors emerge, you have this kind of muted palette and very much these masculine, bold brushstrokes that really show dissolved forms, which is a classic style of the Impressionist artists. This painting from 1924, Desert Gold by Anna Hills, is an unusually large example of her painting style. Anna Hills was a very interesting lady. Interesting, first of all, that she was a lady at a time where that was unusual. She was born in Chicago in 1882 and had an artistic background very early in her life. She wound up teaching at the Chicago Art Institute after having been a student there and spending some time in New York City. In 1913, she moved to California, more specifically Laguna Beach, where she became a major player in the Laguna Beach art community. She ultimately would found the Laguna Beach Art Association, which ultimately led to her helping to fund the then new Laguna Art Museum. She was an interesting artist. As I said, this was a much larger painting than most of the paintings she's done. She uses a palette knife, and if you have a chance to get close to this painting, you'll see a great deal of palette knife usage, which was unusual, and it's one of the hallmarks of her style. She was very well respected and very sought after by collectors. And this is actually one of the more recent acquisitions that the Jonathan Art Foundation brought into the club. We're in front of Late Afternoon California Foothills, a painting by Granville Redmond. But first, a little bit about Granville Redmond. He was born in Philadelphia in 1871, and at the age of 3, he developed scarlet fever and lost his hearing. He would go through life never hearing and never speaking, but he became one of California's most prominent artists. He had the good fortune that his parents moved him to California at the age of 6, and actually enrolled him in the School of the Deaf in Berkeley, California, where he went for 11 years. There at the school, he met a teacher who helped to nurse his artistic talent and to develop a style that would be uniquely his. Early in his career, he painted in kind of muted tones, what artists will refer to as a tonalistic style. The club is fortunate to have two paintings from that era, one of which they actually bought from Granville Redmond's after he painted it in Los Angeles in 1905. The painting I'm in front of is a little bit more indicative of his later style. This would be considered really a transition painting. He's starting to move into his later paintings of almost a pointillistic style of painting. You can see the foreground, a lot of dissolved shapes, but he uses the highlighted snow on the mountains. He uses a few little glimpses of light coming through the tree to create this depth. And yet you still have a relatively low-key foreground. Later in his career, he would go to a very bright, almost postcard style. Collectors revere his poppy fields with oak-studded hills, rolling hills and snow-capped mountains in the background, which was a style that was very popular with the wintering affluent people who came to Southern California during that period. Granville's own personal favorites were the much more muted styles that had luminescent sky, often sunset. He was an interesting guy. When he moved to LA, he actually struck the acquaintance of Charlie Chaplin early on, and they developed a very deep friendship. Chaplin kind of learned styles of pantomime from Granville Redmond, and he also provided a studio at the studios for Redmond to paint while he was on set. If you look at some of the movies of Chaplin's, like City Lights, you'll actually see cameos of Granville Redmond in that particular one as a sculptor, and in another one of Chaplin's movies, he often appeared as a cameo. Sierra Lake is a painting by Edgar Payne. Edgar Payne was born in 1884 in Washburn, Missouri. At the age of 14, he left his house because his parents really didn't want him to pursue a career in art, but he was intrigued, fascinated with art, and he moved to Chicago. Very briefly, he tried to enroll in the Art Institute of Chicago, but quickly found out that the school structure was not for him. So in essence, he was self-taught. This particular painting, as I mentioned, Sierra Lake, is a classic example of his Sierra paintings. He was a prolific painter of the Sierra Nevada, and really no early California collection would be complete without an example of his Sierra Nevada scenes. Edgar's style was very bold. If you stand near this painting, very, very thick, large brushstrokes, lots of grays and taupes, and a style that is really uniquely his. He had moved to California in 1914 after visiting in 1909. In 1916, he was given a commission by the Santa Fe Railroad to paint scenes of the Southwest U.S. And he went to Canyon de Chelly, which is in the northwest corner of New Mexico, and painted a number of works there that became very much his early seminal works. Later in California, he settled in Laguna Beach and was also a prolific painter of the Laguna Beach coastline and the hills and valleys within Irvine and the San Gabriel Valley. But his classic works are like this, the Sierra Nevada scenes. John Marshall Gamble was born in Morristown, New Jersey in 1863. His dad worked for a steamship company, so for the first 20 years of his life, John Gamble had the opportunity to see the world and eventually settled at the age of 20 in San Francisco, California. There he started his studies in art and had a studio and became a very talented and up-and-coming artist. With the earthquake in 1906, which destroyed his studio and wiped out in the fire all of his inventory of painting, John Marshall Gamble set out to go down to Los Angeles to basically set up shop there. The story goes he never got past Santa Barbara. When he reached Santa Barbara, he enjoyed the environment, he enjoyed the city, and so he wound up staying in Santa Barbara for the rest of his career. he would develop an oeuvre that was very similar to what we're standing in front of. He was very much into the hillsides of that part of California, the lupine, the poppies. And in fact, this painting, Poppies and Lupine, painted in 1912, is an excellent example of his finest work. Collectors of California art are always drawn to the wildflowers in full bloom in the spring. And this is a classic painting that delivers that in force. You see this beautiful California countryside with the brilliant oranges and purples of the poppies and lupine, and then you see the kind of distant river basin in the valley with the light on the mountains. Very much a California scene. A recent acquisition by the Jonathan Art Foundation, this painting is among the best that John Marshall Gamble has executed.
Thank you for joining us on our virtual tour of the art at the Jonathan Club.